Cat protects family every night. When they discover why, they're shocked. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The city was alive with its usual nighttime symphony, distant car horns, the hum of passing traffic, and the occasional chatter of neighbors returning home late. In a cozy apartment perched on the fourth floor of a small building, the Miller family had settled in for the evening. The warm glow of their dining room lights spilled out onto the streets below, accompanied by bursts of laughter and the clinking of dinner plates. Life inside the apartment was routine, comfortable, and utterly unremarkable. Unremarkable, except for Whiskers. The family's tabby cat had always been a little quirky. Adopted from a shelter 2 years ago, Whiskers had quickly become a beloved member of the family. He was playful with the kids, affectionate with the parents, and more intelligent than any cat they had ever known. But recently, Whiskers had started behaving differently. Every night, like clockwork, Whiskers would abandon his favorite napping spots and begin his patrol. He moved methodically from room to room, pausing at windows and doors. His ears twitched at the slightest sound, his tail swished with determination, and his sharp green eyes scanned the shadows as though he were searching for something or someone. At first, the family found his behavior endearing. "He's just protecting his territory," Mrs. Miller had joked one evening, watching Whiskers stand sentinel by the front door. You know how cats can be. The kids, Mia and Ethan, turned it into a game, pretending to follow Whiskers on his patrols. "What do you see, Whiskers?" Mia would whisper dramatically, crouching beside him. "Is it a ghost?" But over time, Whiskers' actions became harder to ignore. He wasn't just patrolling. He was alert, tense. Some nights, he would sit by the window for hours, his ears flattened and his fur bristling. Other nights, he would hiss softly, his gaze locked on something outside that the family couldn't see. One particularly quiet evening, Mia woke in the middle of the night to the sound of soft growling. At first, she thought it was a bad dream. But when she opened her eyes, she saw Whiskers perched on the windowsill, his body stiff and his tail puffed up like a bottle brush. The faint glow of the city lights outside outlined his tense figure. "Whiskers," Mia whispered, sitting up in bed. She rubbed her eyes and looked out the window, but there was nothing there, just the empty alley below. Still, Whiskers didn't move. He stared into the darkness, his ears flicking back and forth as if listening to something only he could hear. Mia slid out of bed and padded over to him. "What are you looking at?" she asked, scratching behind his ears. Whiskers leaned into her touch for a moment before returning his intense focus to the window. Uneasy, Mia pulled the curtains closed and carried Whiskers back to her bed. But as soon as she lay down, he leapt back to the windowsill, resuming his silent vigil. The next morning, Mia told her parents about Whiskers' strange behavior. "He was growling at the window all night," she said, her brow furrowed. "It was kind of creepy." Mr. Miller chuckled as he poured himself a cup of coffee. "He's just being a cat, sweetheart. They're nocturnal, remember? Probably saw a bird or a raccoon." "But what if it wasn't a bird?" Ethan chimed in, his voice full of dramatic flair. "What if Whiskers saw something spooky? Like a ghost?" Mrs. Miller rolled her eyes, but Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the days turned into weeks, Whiskers' nightly patrols became more intense. The family began waking up to find faint scratches on the front door and windowsills. At first, they assumed it was the neighborhood strays. But then, one morning, Mr. Miller noticed something odd. "These scratches are too high up for a cat," he said, crouching to inspect the front door. "And there, deep." Mrs. Miller frowned, leaning over his shoulder. "You think someone's trying to break in?" "I don't know," Mr. Miller admitted. "But it's weird. Whiskers has been acting on edge lately, too. Maybe he's picking up on something." That evening, as the family sat down for dinner, Whiskers took his usual place by the living room window. He stared out into the night, his tail flicking in agitation. Suddenly, he let out a low growl, startling everyone at the table. "What's his deal?" Ethan asked, craning his neck to see what Whiskers was looking at. Mr. Miller got up and walked over to the window. He peered into the darkness but saw nothing unusual. "Probably another stray," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'll set up a camera tomorrow, just in case." The following night, Mr. Miller placed a small camera near the front door and another by the living room window. He He set them to record overnight, hoping to catch whatever was causing the scratches and Whiskers' strange behavior. That night, Whiskers was more agitated than ever. He darted between the front door and the living room, his growls growing louder and more frequent. The family could hear him from their bedrooms, his claws clicking against the hardwood floor as he paced. By morning, everyone was on edge. Mr. Miller retrieved the footage from the cameras, eager to find an explanation. As the family gathered around the computer, the first video began to play. The camera by the front door showed nothing unusual, just the faint movement of shadows as the wind rustled the trees. Then they checked the second video. At first, the living room footage seemed just as uneventful. The camera showed Whiskers perched on the windowsill, his body tense as he stared outside. But as the minutes ticked by, a faint movement appeared in the corner of the screen. "What's that?" Mia asked, pointing. Mr. Miller paused the video and rewound it. The family leaned closer, their faces illuminated by the screen's glow. The movement was subtle, a shadow shifting in the alley outside the window. Then, slowly, the shadow grew larger. A figure emerged from the darkness, stepping into the faint light of the street lamp. It was a man dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. He stood still for a moment, staring up at the apartment. Then he moved closer, his gloved hand reaching out to touch the window pane. The family gasped in unison. "He's trying to get in," Mrs. Miller whispered, her voice trembling. Whiskers' reaction on the video was immediate. The moment the man appeared, the cat began growling, his fur bristling as he crouched low on the windowsill. When the man reached for the window, Whiskers let out a loud hiss, his claws scraping against the glass. The man flinched and stepped back, disappearing into the shadows moments later. The video ended, leaving the family in stunned silence. Whiskers, oblivious to their shock, sat calmly by the window, his tail swishing as if to say, "I told you so." Mr. Miller was the first to speak. "We're calling the police." The police arrived within the hour, their flashing blue and red lights illuminating the street outside the Millers' apartment. Two officers, one tall and stern-looking and the other younger and softer-spoken, stepped into the living room where the family had gathered. Whiskers was perched on the armrest of the couch, his watchful eyes following their every movement. Mr. Miller wasted no time showing them the footage. The officers leaned over the laptop screen, their expressions growing serious as they watched the shadowy figure approach the apartment. "Looks like someone was definitely trying to break in," the taller officer said, his voice low. "You're lucky your cat scared him off." The younger officer nodded, glancing at Whiskers with a smile. "That's one sharp feline. He might have just saved you from something serious." The family listened intently as the officers explained the next steps. "We'll increase patrols in the area," the older officer said. "But in the meantime, make sure your doors and windows are secure. And keep that camera running. You might get more footage if he comes back." The idea of the intruder returning sent a chill through Mrs. Miller. She wrapped an arm around Mia, who had been unusually quiet since the video was shown. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's hard to say," the younger officer replied. "But most burglars don't like attention. Your cat making all that noise probably scared him off for good." The officers left shortly after, leaving the family with a list of safety precautions and a lingering sense of unease. That night, they double-checked every lock and window, added a heavy wooden rod to block the sliding door, and even moved a chair in front of the front door as an extra barrier. But despite their efforts, it was Whiskers who truly made them feel safe. As the family settled into bed, the tabby resumed his patrol, pacing the apartment with an intensity that only he seemed to understand. The following days passed uneventfully, though Whiskers remained vigilant. His nightly patrols continued, and the family began to rely on him as their first line of defense. "He's better than a guard dog," Ethan said one evening as Whiskers crouched by the front door, his ears twitching at the faint sounds outside. Still, the fear of the intruder lingered. The scratches on the doors and windows seemed more ominous now, a reminder of how close danger had come. Mr. Miller installed additional cameras, including one on the fire escape outside Mia and Ethan's bedroom window. He also added a motion-activated light near the apartment's entrance, hoping it would deter anyone from approaching. 3 nights later, the light activated. It was past midnight, and the apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Whiskers was sitting by the living room window when a sudden burst of light caught his attention. He jumped down and darted toward the front door, his growl low and urgent. The noise woke Mrs. Miller, who sat up in bed, her heart pounding. She nudged her husband. "The light," she whispered. It turned on. Mr. Miller grabbed his phone and hurried to check the camera feeds. His stomach dropped when he saw the same shadowy figure from before, now illuminated by the motion-activated light. The man was standing at the front door, his hand reaching for the doorknob. "Call the police," Mr. Miller said, his voice tense. Mrs. Miller dialed 911, her fingers shaking as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. Meanwhile, Whiskers let out a series of loud, angry meows, his small body bristling as he clawed at the door. The man outside flinched at the noise, glancing toward the camera before backing away. Seconds later, he turned and fled into the night. When the police arrived, they reviewed the new footage and confirmed what the Millers already suspected. The intruder had returned, likely with the intent to break in. "He's testing the waters," the older officer explained, "trying to see how far he can go without being caught." "But why us?" Mrs. Miller asked, clutching Mia tightly. "We don't have anything valuable." "Sometimes it's not about what's inside," the younger officer said gently. "It could be about opportunity, an open window, an unlocked door. But you're doing everything right. And your cat," he glanced at Whiskers, who was still sitting by the door, his tail flicking irritably. "He's doing an incredible job keeping watch." The next morning, the family decided to take additional precautions. They reinforced the locks on the windows and installed a heavy-duty deadbolt on the front door. Mr. Miller also reached out to their landlord, requesting that the building's main entrance be equipped with a security system. But despite the heightened security measures, the family couldn't shake their fear. Whiskers, however, remained undeterred. Every night, he patrolled the apartment with the same unwavering determination, his sharp eyes and keen ears attuned to every sound and movement. The turning point came a week later. It was a chilly, quiet evening, and the family had gathered in the living room to watch a movie. Whiskers sat on the windowsill, his body relaxed but his eyes scanning the street below. Suddenly, he tensed, his ears flattening against his head. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, leaning forward to see what Whiskers was looking at. Before anyone could respond, Whiskers leapt from the windowsill and darted toward the front door, letting out a loud, guttural growl. At the same moment, the motion-activated light outside the apartment flicked on. Mr. Miller grabbed his phone and pulled up the camera feed. His heart sank as he saw the intruder standing at the front door once again, this time holding what appeared to be a crowbar. The family froze, their fear palpable as they watched the man on the screen. Whiskers, however, sprang into action. He clawed at the door with relentless determination, his loud, angry meows echoing through the apartment. The commotion seemed to unnerve the intruder, who hesitated for a moment before turning to leave. But this time, the police were already on their way. Earlier that day, Mr. Miller had arranged for an officer to patrol the neighborhood during the late hours. As luck would have it, the patrol car arrived just as the intruder was retreating. The officers apprehended the man without incident, and a search of his belongings revealed tools commonly used for break-ins. The family watched from the window as the police took the man into custody. Relief washed over them, though their hearts still raced from the ordeal. Whiskers, seemingly satisfied with the outcome, returned to his spot on the couch and began grooming himself as if nothing had happened. The officers confirmed that the man was responsible for several burglaries in the area. "You're lucky," the younger officer said as he prepared to leave. "Your cat's instincts were spot on. He probably saved you from something serious." In the days that followed, the Miller family couldn't stop talking about Whiskers' heroism. They showered him with affection, buying him new toys, treats, and even a plush bed shaped like a crown. Whiskers, ever humble, continued his nightly patrols as if it were just part of his routine. But for the Millers, he was more than just a cat. He was their guardian, their protector, and their hero. In the days after the intruder was apprehended, the Miller household seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. For the first time in weeks, the family slept soundly, confident that they were safe. But their gratitude toward Whiskers grew immeasurably. He was no longer just a pet. He was a true member of the family, a hero who had risked his life to protect them. The story of Whiskers' bravery began to spread. It started with the police officers who had handled the case, sharing the tale of the fearless Tabby with their colleagues. Then, one of the neighbors, curious about the commotion the night of the arrest, asked the Millers what had happened. By the end of the week, Whiskers had become something of a local celebrity. A few days later, a reporter from a local news station knocked on their door. She introduced herself with a warm smile, explaining that she'd heard about Whisker's heroic actions and wanted to feature the story. "We'd love to share your experience," she said, gesturing to the camera crew standing behind her. "It's not every day you hear about a cat protecting its family from a burglar." The Millers hesitated at first, unsure about inviting so much attention into their home. But as they glanced at Whiskers, who sat proudly on the windowsill as if he understood every word, they couldn't help but agree. The interview was held in their living room, with Whiskers stealing the spotlight. The reporter asked questions about how they'd adopted him, what his behavior had been like leading up to the break-ins, and how they felt about his role in protecting the family. "Honestly, we didn't realize how special he was at first," Mr. Miller admitted. "He was just this quirky little guy who liked to patrol the house at night. But now," he paused, looking at Whiskers with a mixture of pride and affection, "now we know he was watching over us the whole time." The kids chimed in with their own stories, recounting how Whiskers had growled and scratched at the door to warn them of danger. "He's the best cat in the world," Mia said, hugging Whiskers tightly. "I don't know what we'd do without him." The segment aired that evening, accompanied by footage of Whiskers lounging regally in his new crown-shaped bed. Viewers across the city were captivated by the story, and the Millers were soon inundated with messages from strangers who wanted to express their admiration for the heroic tabby. Local businesses reached out, offering gifts for Whiskers. A pet supply store sent a year's worth of premium cat food, while a custom collar company delivered a sleek, engraved collar that read, "Whiskers, Guardian of the Miller Family." But for Whiskers, life continued much as it always had. He still spent his nights patrolling the apartment, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Even with the intruder behind bars, Whiskers seemed to understand that his job was never truly done. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Ethan looked over at Whiskers and asked, "Do you think he knew? Like, really knew that the man was dangerous?" Mrs. Miller smiled thoughtfully. "I think animals have instincts we don't fully understand. Maybe he sensed the man's intentions. Or maybe he just loves us enough to protect us, no matter what." Mia nodded, her eyes shining with admiration. "He's like a superhero," she said. "But instead of a cape, he has fur." Mr. Miller chuckled. "Well, superhero or not, we owe him everything. I think we should do something special to thank him." The family spent the next weekend turning their idea into reality. They transformed a corner of the living room into Whisker's very own hero headquarters. They built a climbing tree decorated with dangling toys and soft cushions, added a cozy cat cave, and hung a framed picture of Whiskers wearing his new collar. When they unveiled the setup, Whiskers approached cautiously, his nose twitching as he inspected each element. Then, with a contented meow, he hopped onto the climbing tree and stretched out on one of the cushions. The family burst into laughter, their hearts full as they watched their beloved cat settle into his new domain. As time passed, Whisker's fame continued to grow. The local animal shelter where he'd been adopted reached out, asking if they could feature him in their campaign to promote pet adoptions. The Millers happily agreed, providing photos and stories about Whisker's journey from a stray to a hero. The campaign was a huge success. Families across the city were inspired to visit the shelter, adopting cats and dogs in record numbers. The shelter staff credited Whiskers with helping them find homes for dozens of animals, and they invited the Millers to a special event honoring their extraordinary cat. The event, held at a nearby park, was a celebration of animal heroes. Dozens of families brought their pets, sharing stories of loyalty, bravery, and companionship. Whiskers, wearing his engraved collar and a small blue ribbon, was the star of the show. Mia and Ethan beamed with pride as they introduced Whiskers to other attendees. "This is our guardian angel," Mia said, scratching behind his ears. "He's the reason we feel safe." As the day came to a close, the shelter director presented the Millers with a plaque that read, "In honor of Whiskers, protector and hero." The crowd erupted into applause, and Whiskers let out a soft meow, as if acknowledging their appreciation. That night, as the family returned home, they placed the plaque on the wall beside Whisker's hero headquarters. The tabby curled up in his crown-shaped bed, his tail flicking contentedly as the family gathered around him. "You've changed our lives," Mrs. Miller said softly, stroking Whisker's fur. "Not just because you protected us, but because you reminded us how important it is to look out for each other." Mia and Ethan nodded, their eyes heavy with sleep but full of love. "You're our hero, Whiskers," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. As the apartment grew quiet and the city outside settled into its nightly rhythm, Whiskers began his patrol once again. He moved through the rooms with practiced precision, his ears attuned to every creak and rustle. Though the family was safe for now, Whiskers knew the world could be unpredictable. And as long as he was there, nothing would harm his family, not on his watch. Life had returned to a comfortable routine in the Miller household, but the impact of Whiskers' heroics continued to ripple through their lives. It wasn't just the family that saw him differently now. Neighbors and strangers alike began to notice the tabby who had saved the Millers from harm. Whiskers had become something of a local icon, and every time Mrs. Miller went to the grocery store or Mr. Miller walked to the park with Mia and Ethan, someone would inevitably stop to ask, "How's the famous Whiskers doing?" Whiskers himself, though oblivious to his fame, had grown even more confident. His nightly patrols remained steadfast, but his daytime demeanor shifted. He carried himself with a quiet pride, his green eyes shining with a keen awareness of his place in the family. The Millers couldn't help but marvel at how a cat who had once been a shy, skittish stray had become the heart of their home. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rumbled in the distance, the family gathered in the living room. Mia and Ethan were sprawled on the rug, sketching pictures of Whiskers, while Mr. and Mrs. Miller sipped coffee on the couch. Whiskers lay nearby, his tail twitching lazily as he watched the rain streak down the window. "You know," Mr. Miller said, glancing over at Whiskers, "I've been thinking about something." Mrs. Miller raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "I think we should write about Whiskers, really share his story. Not just with the news, but something more lasting. Like a children's book." Mia and Ethan perked up at the idea. "A book about Whiskers?" Mia exclaimed, her eyes lighting up. "Can I draw the pictures? And I'll help write it." Ethan chimed in, already imagining the adventure-filled pages. Mrs. Miller smiled warmly. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Whiskers' story could inspire so many people, especially kids, to see how special animals are." Over the next few weeks, the Millers worked together to bring their idea to life. Evenings were spent brainstorming, writing, and illustrating the tale of Whiskers the Hero, a story about a brave tabby who protected his family from danger. Mia and Ethan poured their creativity into the project, drawing Whiskers in all his heroic poses, perched on the windowsill, clawing at the door, and standing guard over the sleeping family. When the book was finally finished, they had copies printed and shared it with neighbors, friends, and the local school. The response was overwhelming. Parents wrote letters thanking the Millers for teaching their children about the value of animals, while teachers invited the family to speak at classrooms and share Whiskers' story. One sunny Saturday, the family was invited to a local bookstore for a special event. The store had decided to feature Whiskers the Hero as part of their community reading program, and dozens of families gathered to hear the Millers talk about their remarkable cat. Mia and Ethan took turns reading aloud from the book, their voices filled with pride as they brought Whiskers' story to life. At the end of the event, the bookstore owner surprised the family with a special gift, a portrait of Whiskers, painted by a local artist. The image captured Whiskers in all his glory, sitting proudly with his green eyes glowing and his collar gleaming in the light. The family was touched beyond words. "This is going in the living room," Mrs. Miller said, her voice thick with emotion. Right above his hero headquarters. Whiskers, sitting calmly on a table near the crowd, let out a soft meow, as if giving his approval. As the weeks turned into months, the Millers' connection with Whiskers deepened. The cat's nightly patrols remained an essential part of their routine, but his role in their lives had grown far beyond that. He had become a symbol of courage, loyalty, and the unexpected ways love could manifest. One evening, as the family gathered on the couch to watch a movie, Whiskers climbed onto Mrs. Miller's lap, something he rarely did. She scratched behind his ears, smiling as he purred contentedly. "You know," she said softly, "I think Whiskers was meant to find us. He didn't just save us from that man, he's taught us so much about trust and bravery." Mia and Ethan nodded, their eyes fixed on Whiskers. "We're so lucky to have him," Mia said. "He's not just a pet. He's family." Whiskers, sensing the warmth and love around him, stretched out luxuriously, his green eyes half closed. In his own quiet way, he seemed to agree. As the seasons changed, Whiskers continued to cement his place as not just the Millers' guardian, but also their constant companion and beloved family member. The once skittish stray had now become the center of their home, his every movement noticed and cherished. Even the neighbors had begun to treat him as a community figure, often stopping by to leave small treats or toys for the famous guardian cat. But one particular evening, something remarkable happened, something that left the family more in awe of Whiskers than ever before. It was a quiet autumn night, and the Millers were enjoying a warm dinner together. Outside, the wind carried the faint rustle of falling leaves. Whiskers, as always, was perched on his usual spot by the window, his eyes scanning the dimly lit street below. He seemed relaxed, but his ears occasionally twitched, always attuned to the subtle sounds of the night. Suddenly, his posture changed. He sat up straight, his fur bristling as his green eyes locked onto something outside. His tail began to flick sharply, a clear sign that something had caught his attention. "Whiskers," Mrs. Miller said, glancing over at him. "What's wrong, boy?" Whiskers leapt down from the windowsill and darted toward the door, letting out a loud, urgent meow. The family froze, their forks hovering midair. "Do you think?" Mia began, her voice trailing off as her eyes widened. Mr. Miller stood up and walked to the door, his heart pounding. He peeked through the peephole but saw nothing unusual. "There's no one there," he said, turning back to the family. But Whiskers wasn't convinced. He scratched at the door, his meows growing louder. A moment later, the sound of faint crying reached their ears. It was coming from just outside the apartment door. Mrs. Miller gasped, placing a hand over her mouth. "Is that a baby?" Mr. Miller quickly unlocked the door and opened it. There, on the doorstep, was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. The faint cries grew louder as the cool night air swept through the hallway. "Oh my goodness," Mrs. Miller whispered, rushing to scoop up the bundle. She peeled back the blanket to reveal a baby, a tiny, wide-eyed infant, shivering from the cold. The family stared in stunned silence, their hearts racing as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. Whiskers padded forward, his sharp green eyes softening as he sniffed the baby. Then, as if satisfied that the child was safe, he let out a soft purr and rubbed against Mrs. Miller's leg. "How did he know?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with awe. "How did Whiskers know there was a baby out there?" Mia knelt beside Whiskers, wrapping her arms around him. "Because he's amazing," she said simply. "Whiskers always knows when someone needs help." The family called the authorities, who arrived promptly to take custody of the baby and begin an investigation. The officers, many of whom were already familiar with Whiskers' previous heroics, were once again impressed by the cat's instincts. "You got yourself a one-of-a-kind protector here," one officer said, crouching to pet Whiskers. "It's like he has a sixth sense." As the officers left with the baby, the Millers couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude for Whiskers, for the chance to help someone in need, and for the mysterious ways life seemed to unfold. The next morning, the story of Whiskers and the abandoned baby spread quickly. Local news outlets picked up the story, and before long, it had gone viral. Headlines like "Hero Cat Saves Abandoned Baby" and "Feline Guardian Strikes Again" appeared on websites and social media feeds across the country. Messages of admiration poured in from people all over the world. Some shared their own stories of remarkable pets, while others simply expressed their awe at Whiskers' incredible instincts. The Millers were overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and support. But for Whiskers, life went on as usual. He resumed his patrols, keeping watch over the apartment with the same quiet determination as always. To him, the events of the previous night were just another part of his duty, a duty he took seriously, even if he didn't fully understand it. Weeks later, the family received a heartfelt letter from the social worker handling the baby's case. The letter explained that the infant had been placed with a loving foster family and was thriving under their care. Enclosed was a photo of the baby, now healthy and smiling. The Millers framed the photo and placed it beside Whiskers' hero plaque in the living room. It served as a constant reminder of how one small act of vigilance and one extraordinary cat had made a world of difference. As the seasons continued to change, the Millers often found themselves reflecting on how much Whiskers had brought into their lives. He had protected them, inspired them, and shown them the true meaning of loyalty and love. He wasn't just their cat, he was their guardian, their hero, and their constant source of joy. One evening, as the family gathered on the couch for their usual movie night, Whiskers climbed onto Mia's lap and began to purr. She stroked his fur, smiling down at him. "You're the best thing that ever happened to us," she whispered. "Thank you for choosing us." Whiskers closed his eyes, his purring growing louder as the warmth of the family surrounded him. And as the night unfolded, with the city humming softly outside and the stars twinkling above, Whiskers knew one thing for certain. This was his home, and these were his people. He would protect them always.